American Chesterton Society and publisher of Gilbert Magazine. He is the creator and host of the EWTN television series, The Apostle of Common Sense. Dale is the author of 4 books and has edited 8 books of writings by G.K. Chesterton. Recognized as one of the leading Chesterton scholars in the world, he has given over 500 lectures at major colleges and universities and other venues, including Yale, Columbia, Cornell, Notre Dame, Oxford, Cal Berkeley, Caltech, Rice, Penn, Dartmouth, San Pablo in Madrid, the Vatican Forum in Rome, and the House of Lords in London. He is a senior fellow of the Chesterton Library at Oxford. He is the co-founder of Chesterton Academy, a high school near Minneapolis, Minnesota, which was named one of the top 50 Catholic high schools in the United States. Dale received his Bachelor of Arts from Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota, and a Master of Arts from Hamline University in St. Paul, Minnesota. He and his wife, Laura, have 6 children. And with that, I will turn it over to Dale Ahlquist.
Yeah.
Thank you, Robert, for reading that good introduction. And thanks for inviting me, and thank you, everyone, for taking the trouble to come tonight on a beautiful summer evening. I am here to talk about conversion. I am one, a conversion. How many other converts do we have in this tonight? That's great. Roland, I didn't know you were a convert. That's great. What were you before?
Nothing. I was just a bad guy. Until my wife pulled me out of the dumpster.
You know, Roland, you'd probably give a more interesting talk than I would. Roland pulled out of a dumpster from the faith. Well, you know, the short story of my own conversion is that I read G.K. Chesterton. Chesterton brought me to the Catholic Church, and I want to talk about his conversion and my conversion. He also was a Catholic convert. When he was asked why he became Catholic, he said, "To get rid of my sins." Only the Catholic Church does that. Only the Catholic Church gets rid of your sins. When you walk out of the confessional, says Chesterton, you are 5 minutes old, and your whole life has started over again. And that's really what conversion is. It's your whole life starting over again. And it's something really that every Catholic experiences, though, when they step out of the confessional, is that new beginning. And you turn your back on something old, and you started something new. But there's this continuity. When he had a very long and deliberate conversion. He was raised in a very universalist, Unitarian household where his parents, very loving, kind, artistic people, exposed him to everything and let him read and study everything. But one of the things that he was exposed to was spiritualism. And he started messing around with the equivalent of Ouija boards when he was a young man. And he said he believed in the devil before he believed in God. And he obviously had some very dark experiences as a young man. And they even brought him really to the brink of annihilation. He was tempted to end his own life because he was brought into such a dark place. And he said he was saved by just clinging to one thin thread of thanks that pulled him out of it. He said that he started to put together a philosophy that had to start with one simple axiom, that existence is better than non-existence. And from that he was able to build something very positive. And he said he set off to really start his own religion, and he said when he put the finishing touches on his heresy, it turned out to be orthodoxy. That someone else had come up with the idea about 1800 years before he did. And so he recognized these great universal and historical and tried and true truths that really brought him first into the Anglican Church, as a Christian, and his wife really was so much responsible for that, much like Roland's wife pulling him out of the dumpster. But she, he said, was the first Christian he'd ever met who was happy. And he was an Anglican for about 22 years before he became Catholic, but that whole time he was on a very steady and deliberate and intellectual conversion that took him to Rome. And I'll tell you, when he was such a famous writer at the time that when he was received into the Catholic Church, it was worldwide news. I mean, it was published in all the newspapers, the fact that Chesterton had become Catholic. And it really shocked a lot of people because a lot of them thought he already was Catholic. He'd been defending the Catholic Church for a long time. He'd written half of his famous Father Brown stories already, his stories about this detective priest who obviously is very Catholic. And then there was a group of people that were so shocked because they thought he would never become Catholic. They thought he was too smart to do something like that. And his intellectual and opponent, but friend George Bernard Shaw, who was very much the agnostic, fired off a letter to Chesterton saying, "Gilbert, this is going too far," when he became Catholic. And he said his response really was that becoming Catholic doesn't mean leaving off thinking, it means learning how to think. He said, the Catholic Church is the only thing that saves a man from the degrading slavery of being a child of his age. Because everything in the modern world is based on fashion and trends and changeable ideas and moods and things that are very shallow and very ephemeral. And with the faith, he found something that was permanent. And he knew it. He knew it was the permanent thing. And he also knew that it was really against everything in the world. That the world is moving in one direction and the church is moving in the other. And he said, the dead thing can go with the stream, only the living thing can go against it. And he realized that the Catholic Church was the living thing going against the current of the times. And that's the way it always is going to be. We of course, have witnessed in the last few weeks some horrible currents going against the church. And none of this is new. This is the way it's always been. When the world is going the same way as the church had better be careful, because it could be that it's the church that's actually going the same way as the world. And Chesterton says there have been times when the church has been wedded to the world, and then it's always widowed by the world. Now, he says there are 3 stages to conversion. The first stage is when you decide you're going to be fair to the Catholic Church, where you don't necessarily believe what the church is saying, but you don't believe so much what is being said against the church. You're going to actually try to be impartial. But Chesterton says there is no being fair to the Catholic Church. No one is neutral about the Catholic Church. As soon as you stop being against it, you start being for it. As soon as you stop fighting against it, you suddenly feel yourself drawn towards it. He says you find yourself trapped by the truth. But the second stage is the fun stage, which is discovering the Catholic Church. Just learning all the things that you never knew. He says it's like being in a foreign country for the first time with all these exotic butterflies and animals and flowers that you didn't even know existed. And you're just taking it all in, and it's really the fun part of becoming Catholic. Because you're just, no commitment, and it's all in awe, taking it all, and you can leave anytime you want. Because you're not attached to it, but you're soaking it all up. But then comes the third stage. Running away from the Catholic Church. Because once your head has been convinced, once all of your intellectual objections have been addressed, and you've cleared the ground of all the intellectual obstacles, it's still going to be a matter of the will, and it's still going to be a question of the heart, and are you going to assent to it? Are you going to make the decision and the act of agreement and commitment, and your heart is telling you, don't do this, because everything's going to change. There will be no escape once you say yes. And so you're finding every possible way you can to get out of making that final step. And Chesterton says it ends with the convert entering the church with his head bowed. It's an act of humility. You realize you were wrong. And the outsider is watching, thinking that you are entering a prison or a dungeon. But for the convert, when he steps into the church, he discovers, as Chesterton discovered, and as I discovered, and as every other convert has discovered, that the church is larger on the inside than it is on the outside. And that the inside is the universal place. And the outside is a very narrow and very dark and truly a place of slavery. Freedom is only on the inside. And to the common objections to the Catholic Church, Chesterton says there, from the Protestant point of view, there's really two major objections. The one is the Catholic view of the Bible, and then the other is the Catholic view of the priesthood. And for the Bible, it's very interesting because Chesterton says that the Protestants, congratulated themselves for centuries saying that the Catholic Church did not believe the Bible. And then by the time the 19th century rolled around, they started to congratulate themselves that they didn't believe it either. The big surprise, of course, is that the Catholic Church does believe the Bible and actually has a much more profound understanding of the Bible than do any of the Protestant churches. And of course, there's also that little matter of the fact that the Protestant churches have left out part of the Bible. I know that was a hard thing for me to realize, that the Catholic Church had a larger Bible than the Protestant Church did. And I, said that they had no right to do that, to add those books. But then I had to do the hard work of figuring out, well, who figured out which books go in the Bible in the first place? And the answer for any Protestant is very troubling when you find out it was the Catholic Church that determined which books were in the Bible, and it was some reformers with no authority other than throwing out the books that didn't conform with their own theology. And then he has this great line. He says, I can understand someone looking at a Catholic procession going by and seeing the bells and the smells and the robes and the crucifix and the scrolls and the fire and all of that, and say, it's all bosh. But what I can't understand is someone seeing the same procession go by and saying, it's all bosh, except for the scrolls. Because that's essentially what the sola scriptura theology is. We're just taking the scrolls out of the church, not even taking all of the scrolls, and we're going to say we're basing our theology on this that we have taken from the Catholic Church. Then the other, of course, great objection on the part of the Protestants to the Catholic Church is the priesthood. And of course there's this strange dual objection to the priesthood. One is that these priests have tried to set themselves apart from the rest of us. And the second objection is they're all evil. And it's an objection that always seems to work against itself, because on the one hand they are objecting to priests having a certain holiness to them, which is what the separateness is that's what the definition of holiness is. It's something set apart, and the idea that there must be something underhanded and evil and wrong about what they're doing, and they probably are just really these secret villains. And Chesterton says the objection there, of course, is contradictory, because someone's basically saying, here's someone who goes through all the work of being holy just so that they can be more evil than anyone else. And then, of course, Chesterton had his own great experience with a Catholic priest, which was a priest by the name of Father John O'Connor, who he met about 1904, and Father O'Connor said that he was an admirer of Chesterton's writing, and Chesterton thanked him, and they took a long walk together, and he said he was actually going to tell him about an article he was writing, and it was about the natural virtues of the poor. And Chesterton was always a defender of the poor, always a defender of the underdog. And Father O'Connor just pointed out to him that the poor are as capable of sin as are the rich. That sin is something that affects all people, and all people need to confess their sins. And all of the poor have different temptations than the rich. And the conversation went along those lines, but Chesterton was amazed by how much this priest knew about evil. He said he expected the priest to know about good, but he didn't expect him to know so much about evil. And then the two of them returned to a dinner party that they were attending, and there were two young undergraduates from Cambridge University there, and they started talking about art and history, and Father O'Connor could hold his own talking about art and history with these guys and philosophy, and absolutely impressed them with his knowledge. And at the end of the night, he excused himself, and they said goodnight, and the two Cambridge undergrads said, he's a pretty good guy, I'm really quite impressed with him, but I could never, really abide a life like that, because people like that, they don't know anything about the real world. And Chesterton said he almost laughed in their faces, because he realized that this priest knew more about the real world than these Cambridge undergrads could even imagine. He says, in comparison, they were two babies in the same stroller. And of course, that's what then gave him his idea to create a detective who was a priest. Because, especially in early 20th century England, priests were just completely ignored. They were disregarded. No one thought that priests knew anything, and they were basically ignored when they were in a room or on the road. And so the idea of having a priest solve the crimes was a new idea altogether. It just didn't change the course of detective fiction, because up until then, all detective fiction was Sherlock Holmes. It was the super sleuth who was way too smart, the kind of guy who could hear someone walking in the next room and figure out that one of his parents was Romanian. But what Father Brown knew was how people actually behave, because, well, someone who sits in a confessional all day knows something about how the criminal mind might work. And that was a great breakthrough in detective fiction, to create the underdog detective. And so he was based on this character, on this priest that he knew, Father John O'Connor, who was the priest who eventually received him into the Catholic Church. When he made the decision to become Catholic, he wrote a letter to his mother. When Chesterton did anything important, he wrote a letter to his mother. In fact, when he decided he was going to get married, he wrote a letter to his mother. His mother was sitting across the table from him at the time. As he's writing a letter to his mother about his marriage, he says, "You have just handed me a cup of cocoa." But when he decided to become Catholic, he wrote a letter to her. He was 48 years old. And he said, I am convinced that the fight for the family and the fight for the free citizen and the fight for everything that is normal can only be waged by the one fighting form of Christianity. And that's what he called the Catholic Church, the one fighting form of Christianity. And that it would fight for the family, for the freedom of the citizen, and for everything that is normal. And of course, Chesterton, very prophetic. Those are all the things that are most under attack in the world we live in right now. The family's under attack, the freedom of the citizen is under attack, and the normal is under attack. Chesterton saw the church as being the thing that will fight against them, and he said it was the one fighting form of Christianity. So what was I doing reading G.K. Chesterton as a good Baptist? In fact, what was I doing going to Rome on my honeymoon as a good Baptist? Because as some of you know, that's when I started reading G.K. Chesterton, was on my honeymoon in Rome. Because that's what anyone else would do. And I brought my wife with me on the honeymoon. We were in Rome on the day that Pope John Paul II was shot. And that was May 13th, 81. We were married on May 9th of that year. So now you know, 34 years my wife has been putting up with me. And as I tell people, naturally I was a suspect in the shooting because I was a Baptist. But I had an alibi. I was reading G.K. Chesterton. And when I started reading Chesterton, I knew immediately that I had encountered a writer unlike anything I'd ever encountered. Someone who really put everything together. One of my books is called The Complete Thinker. I recognize that Chesterton is the complete thinker. He wrote about everything and he put it together. Sort of that's the philosophy of the school that I helped get started. We have this integrated approach to knowledge that instead of everything being separated from everything else, which is what Chesterton says the modern world does, and modern education certainly does that. We try to show how philosophy and history and logic and literature and religion and even science and the technical fields are all integrated and have to go together, and all informed by one truth, which is the incarnation. The only thing that can explain everything. Chesterton says that when it comes to the enigma of life, the saints have the answer, and the philosophers don't even have the right questions. And so Chesterton started doing this number on me where I kept reading as much of him as I could. And back in the early 80s, maybe only 5 or 6 of his books were in print at that time. So I was scouring through used bookstores, finding his books, and just devouring them. I did a master's degree at Hamlin and did my thesis on Chesterton. But I'll tell you, the second book I read of Chesterton's was his book on St. Francis of Assisi. And I was vaguely aware of the fact that he had become Catholic, and I didn't understand why someone who was obviously so intelligent could do something like that. And I said, there's got to be some explanation for that. And maybe he became Catholic, but he obviously didn't really believe it, because who possibly could? Because all truth is in the Baptist Church. And yet, I read this. The second book was on St. Francis of Assisi, who truly is one of the great universal saints. He's a saint that appeals to Catholic and non-Catholic alike, even non-Christian. Francis has that appeal. Francis always had that appeal to Chesterton from his whole life. He says Francis was the bridge that connected his early life to his later life, because he was always his friend. And he has this line in there about Francis, that Francis is like the moon to the sun, which is Christ. And the sun is so bright that we can't look directly at it. And we have to see the light of the sun as it reflects off this lesser thing, the moon. And he says that's what the saint does. The saint reflects the light of Christ when the light, to look at it directly, is too bright, too much for our eyes to handle. It's not that there's anything wrong with the light, it's that our eyes are too weak to take in that light. And so we have to look at a lesser light, but then we can see that light. He says Francis reflects the light of Christ. And I remember that line sticking with me. I said, okay, well maybe there's something to something. More than I'll just keep moving along here. It was a 16-year process for me to find my way to the Catholic Church. Ironically, my path to Rome began in Rome. And I had to go all the way around the world in order to get back there. Chesterton says, the first line of the first book of Chesterton's that I read, Everlasting Man, is there are two ways of getting home. One of them is to stay there. And I had to take the more difficult way. And I had to deal one by one with my objections to the Catholic Church. And in the end, my last objection was the same as my first objection. Something that any evangelical has such a difficult time with that you cannot even imagine. It's something that's so hard to explain. And that is the objection to the what?
Blessed Virgin Mary.
Blessed Virgin Mary. Someone understood. Because it is simply not part of our theology. It's not part of our worship. It's not part of our culture. The idea of praying, a rosary, of praying for Mary's intercession, it's just so foreign to our experience altogether. And it always looked like some outside intervention into a purer faith. And we had all kinds of explanations for why the Catholics had this veneration for Mary. But it's one of those things that Catholics have to learn how to explain it in a way that can be understood to the non-Catholic, because it really is a huge objection that they have to start to grapple with. Now, for me, it was what got me there were two different experiences. One was, I certainly had no intention of becoming Catholic, but I did spend a week at a monastery. So I was kind of outsmarting myself, but I go to this monastery. It was the one in Piasta, Iowa. New Melray Abbey. Anybody ever been to that one? It's a Trappist monastery. Yeah, it's really the Trappist experience. You get to live like a monk for a week and go right into you get your own cell. You get to go and you get your own stall to chant in, and it's really a lot of fun. And when I was reading their literature, it said that we have a devotion to the Virgin Mary here because she is the model Christian. After all, she carried Christ within her, and Christ appeared to the world through her. She's the one who revealed Christ to the world, and that's what every Christian has to do. Every Christian has to carry Christ within him, and every Christian has to reveal Christ to the world. And I said, oh, okay, that's the first good explanation I've ever heard of that. That makes sense. Okay, we all do figuratively what Mary did literally. Okay, Mary, that's one for you. But I held out longer, and so after a couple more years, I went to another monastery. And this was a Brigittine monastery. Anybody know anything about the Bridgetines? Only one of the same people who knew about the Trappists. The Bridgetines, devoted to Saint Bridget of Sweden, myself being a Swede, are primarily an order for women, but there are a couple of men's orders around the country, and one of them is in Oregon, in Amity, Oregon, just outside of Salem. And I was on a business trip out there, and I went there for a retreat by myself, and I had dinner with the priest. They have a secular priest because the order itself is all monks, or brothers. There's no priest within the order. So they bring an outside priest to say Mass. And just the two of us were having dinner together. He says grace, he crosses himself. I don't. He says, so you're not Catholic? I said, no, Father. He goes, so what are you doing here? I said, well, you know, I might become Catholic. I don't know. I'm thinking a little bit about it, you know, kind of. So why haven't you converted yet? Okay, nobody had ever asked me that question. And I realized that I was at that point where I had to defend why I wasn't Catholic, and I really didn't have any good reasons left. But I still had one. I said, well, something about Mary. Really eloquently put down the position of all of the very clear Protestant objections to Mary. I said, well, Mary. And he said, do you believe that her soul magnifies the Lord? He quoted scripture to a Baptist. Baptists have no defense against that. But it was the first time I ever thought about that verse. My soul magnifies the Lord. My soul makes God bigger. That's what it means, literally. And we know Baptists take the Bible literally. And that's literally what it means. My soul makes God bigger. That's a gigantic mystical truth that only Mary can say. And I said, well, probably or something. So there was almost nothing left. And I finally, ironically, it was an argument I was having with the gentleman who co-founded the American Chesterton Society with me, who was in the process of leaving the Catholic Church while I was in the process of coming into it. And we had a nice collision. And we were just arguing only about one little aspect of G.K. Chesterton's ideas. And it was a really knockdown, drag-out argument. And as I drove away from that lunch that we had together, I just, because one of the things he said to me, he says, you don't really understand G.K. Chesterton, he said to me. And I should have been insulted by that. But instead, when I was driving away, I was thinking, well, you know, there is one thing about Chesterton that I haven't embraced. And I really do need to go all the way, because I'll never really truly grasp all of Chesterton until I walk the road that he walked. And that was when I made my decision that I'm going to become Catholic. I called up the only priest I knew in the Twin Cities. And someday I'll tell you the rest of that story. So, I was, after I was received in the church, by the way, I was received by a young priest. This was not the priest I called that day. But the priest who actually received me into the church was a young, newly ordained priest with his charism oil still wet behind his ears. And his name was Andrew Cousins. Wow. So he and I kind of came in together. So we share a nice journey together. Oh man, it must have been about 11 or 12 years later, I was out in Oregon again giving a talk, and I called up the priest from the Brigittine monastery, and I said, Father David, I said, this is Dale Ahlquist. He goes, oh, Dale, do you remember me? And I said, Father, do you remember me? And he said, oh, Dale, I've been following your whole career. He said, I'm so proud of you. It was a great moment. I said, I always think back to that conversation we had. I said, that was just a turning point for me when we talked about marriage together. So that was a good moment. The one other thing I need to say, and then I'll take some questions. The one thing that holds people back from becoming Catholic, more than anything else, and every convert, I think, will confirm this. Chesterton talked about it, so it must have happened to him. I know it happened to me. The one thing that really can trip up a potential convert is not anything that some opponent of the Catholic Church will raise as an argument or fling at the church. It'll be something that a Catholic says. Catholics do the worst job of bringing those potential converts into the faith because they say just one wrong word and that can turn them away. It can be different in every case, but it's a situation I realize where we as Catholics, in defending the faith, in presenting the faith, in proclaiming the faith, we just have to be perfect. We have to do everything right, because just doing one thing wrong can do just a huge amount of damage. And so we just always have to be on our guard that we are representing the Catholic Church. And there are people that want to come in, that are hungry for what we have, for the food that we have to give. And we have to be there to present it to them and give it to them. And I can tell you that right now, even with all of the problems in the Catholic Church, especially right here in our own archdiocese, there are still people who are hungry for the truth that we have. And we have to be ready to give it to them, ready to feed them, to give them that truth. And to do it with just absolute love and generosity. And that's what Chesterton, of course, did for me. One of the things that really sealed the deal was when I realized one of the things I did not understand was the communion of the saints as a Baptist, not part of our theology. But when someone suggested that Chesterton should be considered one of the saints, that there should be a movement for his canonization, I had an epiphany. I understood instantly what the communion of the saints meant. I had no doubt that Chesterton was in the presence of God. I had no doubt that he had brought me closer to Christ, which is what saints do. They bring you closer to Christ. And I had no doubt that he would be an advocate for me, which is what saints do. They intercede for you. And I had no doubt that he was a model Christian, which is what saints are, like St. Francis being the moon reflecting the light of Christ. That's what Chesterton did for me. And I realized that I was part of a Chesterton cult, which is what every saint has, a cult. And I realized, yeah, Chesterton should be a saint. And that was many years ago. And I remember back then when I was with the other folks who were interested in Chesterton, and there were 12 of us. And they said, well, this isn't a good idea for Chesterton we shouldn't push Chesterton's sainthood because that would make him too Catholic. And then he wouldn't appeal anymore to people like Dale here. And I said, are you kidding? I said, are you kidding? You're kidding, right? I mean, our idea of saints is that they're all barefoot 14-year-old girls. But the idea of a 300-pound cigar-smoking journalist as a saint, I said, this would be good for the Catholic Church, and you should start promoting his sainthood. And I said, in fact, if you make Chesterton a saint, I'll become Catholic. And nothing was done. I had to become Catholic through the normal channels And now, of all things, I have to be the one leading the charge to get him candidated. But you know what? It's happening. Within a few months, there may be an announcement that the church will make him venerable. So, or servant of God. So, anyways, that's my story. Questions? Thank you.